it's Sam from Sugar Spun Run. Today I'm showing you how to make sourdough donuts. So I've shared quite a few donuts on this recipe, including traditional yeasted donuts. Today, I wanted to share my sourdough version, and I'm really excited about this version because what I've found is a lot of times if you go to make a yeast recipe, a recipe that's traditionally made using yeast, and you want to use sourdough starter, a lot of recipes will also use yeast, you know, like the kind you get in a packet, in order to help get a nice rise and a nice texture with whatever it is you're baking. When I make a recipe that traditionally uses yeast and I'm using sourdough, I want to just use this wild yeast from the sourdough. That's really important to me. So when I developed this recipe, I made it so that we get light, fluffy donuts, and we are only using our tame grown, whatever, I don't know, household grown yeast. So while this recipe is going to take some time because the dough is going to need to rise for, it's going to need to double in size. So it's going to take like 5 to 8 hours, maybe even longer to rise, and then it's going to ferment overnight. The actual steps involved are pretty straightforward, and I really feel like anyone can do this at home. Now for our sourdough starter, you want this to be active and bubbly. I don't know if you can see my line. Anytime I mix up my starter, I put a line so I know once it's doubled. This has doubled, it's nice and bubbly, it's ready to go. You're going to need 2/3 cup of active bubbly sourdough starter. This is 150 grams. I'm just going to pour this right into my mixing bowl. This is my starter Scotty. I've had him for, geez, I think it's been a couple years now. Serves me well. Just a little bit more. We'll feed him and use him for something else later on. All right, next you're going to need 1/3 cup of milk, or 80 milliliters of milk. I'm using whole milk, but I really think any type of milk would probably work okay here, even like a milk substitute, like an almond milk. You want your milk to be at least 100 degrees Fahrenheit. I think that's 38 Celsius. You can warm it in the microwave, you can warm it on the stovetop, whatever you want to do. Just make sure you stir it and you check the temperature. It shouldn't be too hot or it's going to kill your yeast, and if it's too cold, it's not going to help support our yeast growing the way we want it to. So I'm going to add milk. All right, before we go any further, I think I'm done with my scale for now. I'm just going to stir the milk and the sourdough together, get them nicely combined. All right, and next up we're going to add some eggs. You will need 2 large eggs for this recipe. These should be at room temperature. You don't want them too cold. They could kind of like shock your dough. 2 eggs, and 1/3 cup, or like 67 grams of granulated sugar. We're also going to add 3/4 teaspoon of table salt, which is not going to kill your sourdough starter. A lot of people get all up in arms if you add salt to any kind of yeast. It's not going to hurt it, I promise. The concentration is not high enough, so you're safe to add your salt here. We're also going to add some vanilla extract. So not all donut recipes use vanilla in the actual dough, and you could technically skip this if you want, but when I was developing my classic homemade donuts, I added just a little vanilla, and it really adds a nice depth of flavor and subtly enhances the sweetness in a way that I really, really enjoyed. So I always add a little vanilla to my donut dough. All right, now let's go ahead and stir this together. I want to get those eggs broken up. All right, and this is just a bit combined. It's not super well combined, but that's because I want to pause here and add some flour. So I've measured out 3 cups or 375 grams of flour. This is all-purpose flour. I'm going to add about 2 cups of it, or about 2/3 of it now. And after I add this bit of flour, I'm just going to stir it together until everything is nicely combined. Now, anytime you're making a yeast recipe, you know, traditional yeast or sourdough, the exact amount of flour you're going to need can vary. I've talked about this a lot. So we are just going to keep an eye on the texture, and that's going to be our indicator for whether we add all of our flour or not, or if we even need to add a little bit more flour. Okay, before I go any further, I'm going to grab my stand mixer, which I know I get a lot of comments from people asking me to use my stand mixer. So let's bring that into the picture. Here she is. Now let me talk about this for a second. If you don't have a mixer, you can make this recipe without one. You don't want to use an electric mixer. You're going to most likely burn out your motor. So you would do this by hand. The problem with doing this recipe by hand is you really want a nice sticky dough. If you're kneading the dough, you're going to just have to add more flour in order to get it manageable. Otherwise it's going to stick to you, stick to the counter, and it needs to be manageable. You can get away with adding less flour if you're using a machine. Just expect that your donuts aren't going to be quite as light and airy if you opt to do this by hand. I will try to remember to explain the steps to you in case that's the only way you can do it, because they're still going to be tasty. For this next step, sometimes we're going to be adding some butter, and sometimes I'll use my paddle attachment because it really incorporates the butter a bit better. I'm trying to save a dish today, so we're just going to make the dough hook work for everything here. All right, so I mentioned butter. This is the next thing we're adding. I have 6 tablespoons of unsalted butter. Cut it into tablespoon sized pieces, and it's nice and soft. It needs to be nice and soft at this point. If yours isn't, you can pop it in the microwave for a couple seconds. But I did not want to use melted butter for this recipe. Softened just works nicer for giving us a better final texture. So I'm going to add the butter 1 tablespoon at a time and stir until each tablespoon is incorporated before I add the next one. I know everyone's been wanting me to use my mixer, so hopefully you're happy. All right, my lack of patience won over me not wanting to do an extra dish. So we're going to use our paddle attachment at first, and then we'll switch over to the dough hook once we have the butter combined. Butter number 2, butter number 3, 2.5 and 3, there we go. Let's take a look. Butter is all incorporated, so let me scrape all this dough off the beater, off the paddle attachment, and we're going to switch back to our dough hook. Don't waste butter, we don't waste batter. Okay, back to our dough hook. And here is where the rest of our flour comes in. We are going to gradually add the rest of our flour, or as much flour as we need, until we get a dough that is clinging to itself, pulling away from the sides of the bowl. If you touch it, it should not stick to you. It'll be tacky, but it shouldn't like come off on your fingers. So I'm going to keep my mixer on low speed. Let me just add a little bit in now. And on low speed, I'm going to stir this until I get that consistency and texture I'm looking for. Of course, I'm going to show you how it looks. And I've mentioned this already, but you might need to use more flour than we've measured out too. That's okay if you do, but the less flour you can get away with adding, the better, because the lighter and airier your donuts will ultimately be. Let's take a quick look here. This is not done. It is still sticking too much to the side of the bowl. I do want to give it a mix just in case any flour is settled at the bottom, but we are definitely going to need to add more flour here. Let's go ahead and add a bit more. Okay, let's take a look at this point. So I touch it and it's still a bit too sticky. We're gonna add a little bit more. And again, I don't want to overdo it because if I can get away with adding less flour, then that's great. I don't want to overdo it with the flour. Take another peek. You can see, hopefully you can see, this is one of the reasons I don't love using my stand mixer for videos, is because it's much harder to see in the bowl. But I think you can hopefully tell it is clinging to itself and pulling away from the sides of the bowl. So if I touch that, it's not sticking to my hands, not in any significant way. Like if I really push it, I get a little bit, but I'm very happy with how this looks actually. So I'm not going to add any more flour. So now I'm going to knead the dough. It usually takes about 7 to 10 minutes of kneading on like a speed of 2. We're going to knead it until it's smooth and elastic. Right now it looks a little bit bumpy. I'll show you how it looks when it's done, of course. So let's give it another 7 minutes. All right, 7 minutes later, let's take a look. The dough is a lot smoother than it was when we started this. Let me just break off a piece and take a look at it so you can see. It's nice, it's smoother, it's tacky, but it's not sticking to my hands and I can move it. We are in a pretty good place with this dough. So let me make sure I get it all together in a ball, get everything off the dough hook because we don't like to waste anything. Just grab yourself a large mixing bowl. I'm just going to lightly grease this with a little bit of oil. Using avocado oil, you can literally use any cooking oil. Gotta specify cooking oil. If I say any oil, I'm going to get the comments like, can I use motor oil? All right, and let's drop our dough in this bowl. Oil the bowl so it doesn't stick to it when you need to get it out. Every bit of dough in here is a donut you could be eating. You don't want to leave any behind. We're going to cover this with plastic wrap, and you want to let the dough sit in a nice, warm, draft-free place. The dough is going to need to rest until it has doubled in size. So how long this takes, it's going to vary. It depends on like how warm your kitchen is mostly. Right now in the winter, this could take longer than 8 hours to double. What I do is my oven has a proof setting, and I know some people have those like sourdough proofing mats. If you can put it in a warm place like that, I can usually get it to double in size in about 5 to 8 hours. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll put it in my oven. And I did make a batch of dough yesterday. That way I had some to roll out for you today. So yesterday I took like a really short iPhone video of what the dough looks like, just so you can see how much it's increased in volume before I put it in the refrigerator. So this one's gonna go in the fridge, and let me grab that one for you. Okay, so here is my dough that I prepped yesterday. It's fermented in the fridge overnight, so that means at least 12 hours. Once I put it in the bowl, I put the time on it just so I have an idea of how long it's taking me to rise. So this was done at 2 o'clock yesterday. Okay, so I'm going to just lightly flour my surface. and turn the dough out onto my lightly floured surface. And the dough is going to be really thick and it's not going to feel super fluffy. You're gonna be like, oh, it feels dense. That's normal. I get a spatula to get the rest out. I'm not leaving any donuts behind. Plus, you don't want to put this stuff down your sink. Better to get it out of the bowl now. Okay, lightly floured surface, and I'm just going to lightly flour the dough as well. I'm going to flatten it a bit, and I'm going to lightly flour my rolling pin. And we're going to roll this dough to be a half inch thick. That is 1.3 centimeters for you metric folk out there. All right, let's go ahead and cut out our donut holes. I always just kind of lightly flour the cutter first. And of course you want to keep your cuts as close together as possible because we're going to regroup any scraps, and then the donuts you make with regrouped scraps, they're always going to look wonky. So just try to keep the cuts as close together as possible. And I just use 2 cutters to cut out my little donut hole. The donut holes, I don't regroup. I just cook donut holes as is. All right, so our donuts are going to need to rise before we can bake them. So where you put them after you cut them out is going to make a difference in how easy this process is for you. So what I do is I take a piece of parchment paper and I cut it into squares, and each donut is going to get its own square. Don't use wax paper. It's going to stick to the wax paper if you do, because it like absorbs the moisture, and it will be impossible to get the donut off of the wax paper without making it look not like a donut anymore. Before I put it on the parchment paper, I also like to just lightly brush it. It's hard to do one-handed. I would normally sit this down, but like rub a little bit of flour, a very light dusting. You don't want a lot of flour, but a little bit of flour on the parchment to help keep it from sticking. This will make it easier to get the donut into the oil. So lightly dusted, place our donut on top. And then I'm also going to brush the donut with just a little bit of flour as well. Really, really light dusting, because as this proofs, it's going to hit our wax paper that we put on top of this tray, and we don't want it to stick to the, plastic wrap. We're gonna put plastic wrap on top, and we don't want it to stick to the plastic wrap because again, you could end up with really wonky looking donuts. So this just helps create a little bit of a barrier. The donut holes, I don't care as much about these, so I'll put a couple of donut holes on the same square of parchment. Brush with a little flour. If you wanted to not put a hole in the center of the donut, that should be fine too. Like if you wanted to fill them, I don't see why that would be an issue, but I haven't done it. All right, we'll regroup our scraps. Get some more donuts. Just don't be alarmed when they, kind of look a little more craggy and broken. They're still gonna taste delicious. So the cutters that I used for this, for today, they came in a set. I have a whole bunch of rings of different size. This is 2 3/4 inches, and this is like 1 1/4 inches. I will try to remember to link to those cutters as well because I use them for a ton of different things. Now you should be able to get 12 donuts and 12 donut holes out of this recipe. And then these scraps, I could possibly get one more donut out of here. Not super worried about it. I'm just going to mash it all together and just make donut holes out of it. And they're gonna be super funky looking, but that doesn't matter. So I said 12 donut holes, but you're gonna get more than that. And these I'm just going to put on a separate baking sheet. Space them a bit because they'll get sticky and stick to each other. So now we're going to cover our donuts. Remember, you have that little light dusting of flour on them to keep them from sticking to this plastic wrap, because that's what we're going to use is plastic wrap. And we'll need 2 pieces, my favorite thing. And these are going to sit in a warm, draft-free place until they're nicely puffed. I will show you how they look, of course. This takes about 1.5 to 2 hours, but could take longer depending on, again, how cold it is in your kitchen. If you have a proofer oven, this is a great time to use it. You just want to make sure they don't get too warm or they're going to overproof. We are also going to use that handy proofing test I've shared in the past. It's like a little poke test to see if the donuts are ready. We'll go over that when they're ready because they're obviously not yet. I'll see you in like 2 hours. Okay, so my donuts are proofing. Once I feel like they're getting close to being ready, like I feel like I'm like 20 minutes or so out, I'm going to start heating my oil because this can take time, especially if you do it properly, which is what you want to do. I take a medium-sized saucepan. I don't like to use anything too big because I don't like to use a ton of oil. You will need a neutral cooking oil for frying your donuts. So you could use canola oil or vegetable. Those are more inexpensive options and will work fine. I use avocado oil, which is like $3 million a bottle. So I use a smaller pot and I'll cook the donuts 1 at a time or maybe even 2 at a time in a smaller pot. That way I don't have to use as much oil. So I'm going to fill this so it's about 2 inches or 5 centimeters deep with oil. Okay, this is a little closer to 1 inch than 2 inches, but again, It's expensive. So we're going to make this work, but the less oil you use, the more closely you have to watch it. Your oil temperature is going to drop faster, and it will rise again faster when you take the donut out. So you just have to keep a closer eye if you're using less oil. You're gonna be a cheapskate like me. All right, so I'm just going to use my thermometer. I actually prefer to use, I have like a deep frying glass thermometer I prefer to use, but that disappeared on me. So we're going to use my candy thermometer here. And we are going to heat the oil to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, once again, you don't want to heat your oil too fast. It's not good for the oil, it can make things taste funny. So I'm going to turn on my stovetop to medium heat, just below medium heat. So a little higher than low, but not quite at medium. So we'll keep an eye on this. We need it to reach 350. And my donuts do still have a little bit more time to go before they're ready. I will show you what they look like when they're ready to go, because we're going to do that poke test I told you about. Okay, so our oil is getting up to temperature and my donuts are pretty much ready. So let me show you what that looks like. You can see, I hope, the donuts have puffed since we've put them in my proofing oven. So I also like to do this thing called the proof test or the poke test. I don't know what it's called, but you poke the donut to tell if it's proofed. And what you do is you just use your finger. You can lightly flour your finger if it's a sticky dough, and you press it into the donut. What you're looking for is for the dough to spring back about halfway. It shouldn't happen too fast and spring back all the way. If it does, that means it needs more time to proof. If the donut doesn't spring, or the dough doesn't spring back at all, it means the dough is probably overproofed. Overproofed dough is a bummer because there's not really anything you can do to fix it. I say if you've overproofed your dough, bake it or fry it or do whatever you were going to do with it anyway. The results aren't going to be ideal, but they're still going to be edible and better than just throwing it away. So another thing I want to mention is that I always like to set up like a frying station. I just have a baking sheet that I've lined with parchment, but you can line it with wax paper, aluminum foil, whatever. The point of it is just to catch any spills. Paper towels would be fine. And then I put a cooling rack on top. So after I fry my donut, it's going to go over here. Or you could even line this with paper towels, and then that will help absorb any excess oil. So whichever you prefer, but it's just, you want to have a place to put your donuts. So we're almost here. So let's get ready to fry one of these lovely donuts. The way I do it is I will take a spider, a frying spider, and I'll take my donut, and we used parchment paper, not wax paper, and I don't want to just drop it in the oil because we don't want to splash oil. So I'm just going to drop it onto the spider, and then once my oil is at temperature, I will just gently lower this into the oil. So these donuts need to be fried until they are done, basically, which can be a little bit hard to gauge. I find I typically need about 60 seconds on one side, and then I'll flip the donut and cook it for about another 60 seconds on the other side. You can look at the color of the donut. It should be a light golden color, and that's a good way to tell that it's done. But another thing you can do, you can make sure you're maintaining your heat, and you always come back up to temperature between batches, but you could let this donut cool for a couple of minutes while the oil is, rebalancing its temperature, and you can cut into it and make sure it doesn't look doughy. If it's doughy, obviously it needs more time. Alternatively, if it's like dry, then it's baked too long or fried too long. So you will want to cut your time back a little bit next time. Got a nice light golden color there. This is looking pretty good, and we'll move it in just a minute. Another thing you can do is you can use an instant read thermometer and check the internal temperature. I look for an internal temperature of 185 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, this one should be done now. We'll remove this. All right, let's get our next donut. We'll try 2 this time. Put some paper towels down here to catch some excess oil. There you go. I actually like the gold of these donuts a little bit better. First one might have gone a touch too dark. My oil needs a minute to get back to temperature. Just using my instant read thermometer. Wow, we are going to be perfect. 188. That's pretty good. So right now my oil is at 330 degrees. That's too low. You cook your donuts in an oil temperature that's too low, and what's going to happen is they're going to be oily and greasy. And if it's too high, you're going to have crispy donuts where the outside is baked and the inside could even be underbaked. So the temperature really is actually important. We'll just put this number out there for the heck of it. So exactly how long your donuts take is going to depend on a lot of things, just like the rising time depends on a lot of things. Today, I'm actually cooking a little closer to 45 to 50 seconds per side rather than 60. Okay, so while I'm frying the donuts, I want to go ahead and start making the glaze. I love this glaze. It's a buttery, simple vanilla glaze, kind of like you would get on a classic vanilla glazed donut at a donut shop. If you don't want to do this glaze, mix up some of my cinnamon sugar and use that instead, or just plain granulated sugar, you would dip the donuts pretty soon after they come out of the oil. Alternatively, use powdered sugar, but let the donuts cool a little bit before you dip them in powdered sugar or it's going to melt too much. Okay, so for the glaze, 1.5 cups of powdered sugar or 190 grams. Next, we have 1/4 cup or 57 grams of salted butter. Do use salted for the best flavor. If you only have unsalted, you're going to want to like add a pinch of salt and taste it, make sure it tastes good. A lot of times I'll say, oh, make sure it's not too hot. You want this butter to be straight from the microwave. It's totally fine and even desirable for it to be nice and warm still. We'll go ahead and add this in because we kind of want the butter and the hot water we'll add in a second. We want that to melt the sugar a bit. It's going to give us a really nice glaze. We're also going to add 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla extract and then 1.5 to 2 tablespoons of hot water. And this should be nice and hot. Again, the hotter it is, the thinner your glaze is going to be in a very good way. All right, let's whisk everything together. You want to whisk it enough that you don't have any lumps of powdered sugar remaining. I'm going to thin it a bit more. You don't want it too wet or the donut could become soggy, but you do want it to be nice and thin. See, it's ribboning off of the whisk and it's dissolving like right away. That's perfect for this. We'll do a donut and see how it looks. So we'll take a donut, make sure it's cool enough that you can touch it. We'll go ahead and dip one side. You could just dip one side if you want, but I like a lot of glaze. So we're going to dip both sides. And then the excess glaze, just let it drip off. It's a little messy with both sides. So I'm just going to dip one side. These are going to be so good. And then the donut holes. And this glaze should dry just like, you know, a glaze on a donut, shop donut. It will take a little bit of time for the donut to cool completely and the glaze to set. But that is the gist of it. That is how you make homemade sourdough donuts using our, what do we call it? Tame yeast, house-raised yeast, house-broken yeast, I don't know. We used our own sourdough completely, no added store-bought yeast. Pretty proud of that. Cannot wait for you to try these. If you do, or if you have any questions, leave me a comment. I really do always love hearing from you. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. So excited for this. That was a perfect donut. It's like perfectly airy, perfectly sweetened. It's amazing. I love my job. All right, okay, this mixer drives me nuts. Blue mixer's back there laughing like, I would never do this to you. Grab my nemesis. I hear ya. Not sure what you're yelling about.